So welcome to another episode of Man Up, Man Down. This is kind of a pre-taster how we do everything in season or in the next season, because we're going to have a quick summary of how our podcast turns out. So today's podcast was with Caroline Roodhouse, and Caroline lost her husband to suicide, and she very openly talks about it. So very emotional. Say warning ahead. And yeah, David, I don't know how you found it, but there's so many emotions in there, and there's so many things. I mean, we talked about suicide on this podcast before, but it's so lost for words. You know, I mean, it's like,
Well, I guess, like anything, we talk about the statistics rather than, an actual person. So, to hear, and, sort of one of the things like that I mentioned that, when someone dies, the admin is horrific. And, it's sort of having to deal with that, with children, with the grief of losing someone. The grief of losing someone to suicide, it's an inspiring story, and Caroline was just so honest, didn't sugarcoat anything. It's a really powerful episode. It is very sad, it is triggering, but ultimately it's inspirational. So I hope that you, for want of a better word, I'm sure you will enjoy it and you will get a lot to take from it. And it's probably one that, is probably a good one to share because you don't know what people are going through. So anyway,
it's overcoming adversity, as we had in our life event. That's what it is, really, right? And if I say she made the best out of it, she talks about it, trying to prevent more men, more women, more people from doing the same. So enjoy this week's episode.
Welcome to the Man Up, Man Down podcast, presented by Volker Beluda and David Pawsey. We discuss the pressures and challenges faced by men approaching middle age that we're often too embarrassed to speak about with our friends. You can find us online at www.manupdown.com. Enjoy the show, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review.
So welcome to another episode of Man Up, Man Down. Today we're honoured to welcome Caroline Roodhouse. Caroline's a best-selling author, an internal communications consultant and wellbeing specialist, mum to 2 children, and expert by experience on loss by suicide. In 2018, Caroline's husband of 18 years took his own life without warning, leaving behind their 2 young children. Caroline's journey following this tragedy led her to combine her lived experience with her professional skills to become a strategic communications and wellbeing specialist, author mentor and a public speaker. In these roles, she shares her story of grief and loss to give a voice to those impacted by suicide. She has also written the best-selling book Daddy Blackbird, the true story of a family surviving and thriving after loss by suicide. The complex trauma resulting from Steve's sudden suicide has defined Caroline's mission to support and empower others who have faced a similar tragedy, helping them to manage their grief, navigate their complex emotions, prioritise their own well-being, articulate their own story, and ultimately find hope again. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Caroline. A lot to take in there. First of all, condolences. But also, obviously, it is a sad story, but as I'm sure we're here, there is hope at the end. So, perhaps, start with, that terrible day.
Yeah, thank you for having me and for articulating that all so well and introducing me so thoroughly. Going back to that that very defining day, it was back in November 2018, which was just a very normal day. Whatever you would define as normal day in a normal family. Steve was getting ready for work, and we had 2 daughters who were 9 and 2 at the time. I was working part-time, so I was at home that day looking after our youngest, and our oldest was getting ready for school. And Steve was running a bit late. I mentioned that I had a sore throat. He went running up the stairs and got me some throat sweets, because that was just the way he was, just making sure everybody had what they needed, and confirmed he would pick Evie up from Cubs on his way home from work, as he always did on a Monday, and then he left. And everything about that felt very normal to me. And it was around mid-morning that I had a call from his workplace to tell me that he hadn't turned up for work. He was due to start a new role that day. And I was shocked. It had never happened before. He was a really conscientious guy. He was a manager, so he was due to start leading a new team that day. And as the day unravelled, it became very apparent that he seemed to have disappeared off the face of the earth. And eventually later that day, I contacted the police and reported him as a missing person. And all of this was just completely alien to me. I knew nothing about any of these processes. And eventually the police came round, took some details. We then had a horrendous couple of days of having no idea where Steve was, and contacting friends, family, desperately trying to find any trace of him. And it was on the Wednesday morning that the police finally came and gave me the news that I wasn't expecting to receive. And they said 15 words that I'll never forget. They said, "We found him. He's not alive, and it's clear that he's done it to himself." Which, as you can imagine, was the biggest shock of my life, and started a shitstorm of hell that we've been going through ever since. And that was, it was nearly 7 years ago.
Mm. I mean, as you say, I don't think anyone would know about that process until you're in it. Sort of my father passed recently, and the amount of admin is just horrendous. I mean, I don't know how did you sort of keep yourself going? I mean, obviously you've got 2 very young children. I mean, how did you just keep going?
Well, in those moments, initially, the first sort of couple of hours, I was clearly in shock. I had friends around me who had been there trying to help work out how we were going to find Steve. So luckily I wasn't on my own at the time. And the police were there for a while. It became very apparent that the first thing I would need to do was to tell my oldest daughter, who was 9, and she was at school at the time. Her name's Evie. She's now 16. And I had no clue how you start a conversation with your child to say, "Dad's died and he's taken his own life." I mean, where do you begin? Luckily, a friend of mine who was with me contacted an amazing charity called Winston's Wish. And they gave us some brilliant advice over the phone, confirmed that, you need to be clear, direct, open, honest. You can't sugarcoat any of this stuff. So despite how horrific that felt, I walked down to her school and gave her that news with my friend by my side. We returned home after that, and there's very little I remember beyond that. A lot of the gaps have to be filled in by friends and family, because you just kind of blank out. But I know the days after that were all about contacting the coroner, trying to understand what happens next, picking up Steve's stuff from his car, endless conversations with different organisations, banks, utility companies. Everything is just overwhelming when you're at your lowest ebb and you've no idea how to function. And like I say, my priority throughout all of it was my children, and trying desperately to make sure they were okay, when clearly that's an impossibility under circumstances like these.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Winston's Wish, because, I mean, well, off air, we sort of talked about, I got some friends who sadly, their father died at a young age, and Winston's Wish were the charity that fully supported them. And I actually did a run and did some fundraising for them. I mean, were there any other groups that were there to support you?
Yeah, I contacted friends wanted to encourage me to have therapy and find some sort of outlet for the huge emotions that I was experiencing. And I had private therapy because initially, when you first contact bereavement support, they will tell you that you have to wait at least 6 to 9 months before you're ready to have these conversations, because you may be in denial or it's too raw, which, I mean, I've never got my head around. That's the time you need it most. I paid privately for different types of therapy, including PTSD therapy. I was diagnosed with PTSD very early on. I took my oldest daughter Evie to Simon Says, which is a local support group who allow children to just have conversations if they've been bereaved, to have conversations in safe spaces where they'll do things like tell stories, do arts and crafts, make memory boxes, those sorts of things. So we had support from them as well. But yeah, it's a bit of a lottery in terms of knowing what support is out there and who to speak to. I've since connected with an amazing charity called SOBS, who stands for Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide, and they provide support groups and information and a support line as well, for specifically for people bereaved by suicide. So as you go along, you do tend to kind of find out about different services that are available. But yeah, for the children, Winston's Wish was the key one, and they sent brilliant guidebooks through for me that helped me continue these really difficult conversations with them. They sent little worry dolls for the kids to put under their pillows at night. And I contacted their helpline many times with concerns over what should I expect next? Ada's doing this or saying that. How do I respond? And yeah, endless conversations with them, particularly in those early days.
I've only been listening so far, Caroline. So there's so much in there. There's so many questions I want to ask, which might or might not be appropriate, right? It's like, I think, yeah, I honestly don't even know where to start, because if I understand correctly, there were 2 days where you didn't even know where your husband was, right? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. He was
yeah,
missing, and the police were very clear that because he was a low risk,
yeah,
they seem to believe that quite often men in particular might just have some sort of moment where they need to disappear for a couple of days and come home with a bit of explaining to do. But ultimately they'll be safe and well. And that was kind of the message that I was getting from the police, despite having no response on Steve's phone, no activity on bank cards or anything like that. And friends had put out appeals on Facebook and other social channels for any sightings of him. And there was nothing. The only thing the police were able to do, because he was a low risk and low priority, there weren't any resources to kind of throw into trying to find him. So they were just following the ANPR cameras to see if it triggered his car anywhere, which it didn't. And in the end, he was found about 5 minutes down the road in a kind of little wooded area with his car. So it wouldn't have triggered off anything anyway. But yeah, those 2 days were horrendous. But it was the kind of the Wednesday morning that we were told that he'd actually been found. Yeah.
I mean, so those 2 days, when you say low risk, what does it mean? Was it low risk of suicide or low risk?
Yes. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, to clarify, there was no mental health issues. So there was no concern over his safety, or any worries that he could do anything to hurt himself or anybody else, or that anybody else could do anything to hurt him. He was just a kind of normal family guy with a normal life, and no record of any sort of mental health issues whatsoever, and no signs. And we talk about signs a lot. To me, there were no signs. There was no indication whatsoever. He'd had some challenges at work in the years leading up to this, and I know that they had impacted him. And through kind of research and understanding that I've done since then, I've understood that suicide is not generally down to one particular thing. It's a huge number of different aspects. So I've been through that period of torturing myself, not knowing what it was, or desperately trying to put my finger on, was it because his parents both died close together in the same space of time, or was it something I didn't even know about from his childhood, or was it all about work, or was it the pressure of being a dad to two young children? And in the end, I had to accept that I will never know the answer to that. Perhaps it was a combination of all of those things. But yeah, the low risk was down to the fact that there was no concerns for his well-being, physically or mentally.
I mean, that's the thing, right? We can't second guess, right? And I think that makes, and you know, we said that before we went live, right? Rose Wilkins was on the podcast, and she was at our live event as well, right? She does a lot of work with suicide prevention, right? It's not, you know, you never find out. There's this void is there, right? You know, unless the person leaves a note or anything, and I assume Steve didn't, right? It's, you know, and I think that's, you know, you don't get the closure you would get from, if I say, you know, in quotation mark, a normal death, right? Where if someone is ill or something like that.
Absolutely, and that's what makes loss by suicide so much harder, or that's one of the things that kind of amplifies all of these emotions, including anger. I was so angry at him. We'd been together for 18 years, and we talked about absolutely everything, from what we were going to have for dinner, what the kids were doing at the weekend, who was picking up this one and who'd pick up that one, and anything and everything. So how could he possibly not mention that this was something on his mind? So the anger was a big part of my life for a very long time, and it took a lot of support and therapy and learning to kind of take the edge off that anger for me. And yeah, prevention is a tricky thing, because if we don't know that it needs preventing with a particular individual, how can we prevent it? And I think that's why we talk a lot more broadly, including in workplaces, around compassionate communication and creating these open, safe spaces for people to talk. Because unless we know that they want to talk, we're not going to prompt that information out of them. We need them to know that if they are struggling with something, that there is somebody somewhere that they can speak to, or at least indicate that there's something that they need to talk about.
Yeah. As you say, that you can't prevent something you don't know, and unless the person seeks help and knows there's a safe place to talk. And I mean, one of the reasons we launched this podcast, right, to get men to talk about, you know, the high suicide rate in men age 40 plus, and you know, discuss these topics. So yeah, thanks again for being here and sharing the story.
Oh, you're welcome. I hear so often this phrase that gets thrown around, where people say men don't talk, and it frustrates me, because I know that men do talk, given the right environment. If they're sat down with their barber, for example, we know that there's a lot of these movements around where mobile barbers are offering mental health services at the same time. We know that you get a bunch of guys down the restaurant for a curry together, and they'll talk together, or you're playing football. And I mean, I'm probably stereotyping massively with all of this stuff.
I don't think you do.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, you pretty much described, sort of different environments that either I do or I've got close friends that, meet up for a curry. Yeah, like I'm not playing football now. But yeah, that was like, well, since I've stopped playing football, that's what I've missed is like, that camaraderie.
Yeah.
And it is. I mean, we've said it time and time again, and with the people that we've had on the podcast, it's and there are groups where men get together specifically to talk, but generally it's like, well, actually give men sort of an activity, and they'll talk while they're doing it.
Hello, folks. It's Volker here. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. As you know, I coach executives, whether that is for leadership skills, or sales leadership skills, or working as a therapist too. There are few ways I can help you to get unstuck, improve your work-life balance, or become a better version of yourself. So you will be more productive and have more time for your family. Whatever it is, you can join my client list of people from General Electric, Pepsi, DHL, Boots, and many others. Book a free exploratory call via my website, www.obnat.us. That's obnat.us. Now back to the show.
And
those jobs in the house, you could bring them all around here and they can talk in the Jeep.
Open a men's shed. I'm sure you have heard of men's shed. We had them on our podcast, right? And
absolutely. If anyone wants to come and cut the grass.
Charlie said, he says, put a bunch of people in a shed, right? Or a bunch of men in the shed. And they wouldn't talk, right? But put a lawnmower in the middle that needs fixed, right? They all have an opinion. And I use...
Especially if it's a broken lawnmower, they need to fix it.
It's, and that works. And it's funny that, right? I mean, men don't talk unless, there's something I have an opinion about, or, need to stand up. And Anita Malster, she made this really interesting comment, which I use all the time. Men talk better shoulder to shoulder, right? It's if they go into war, absolutely. Or they go into, go hunting, right? And that's probably where it's coming from, right? When we were hunting the saber-toothed tigers, or the mammoth back in the day, right?
Yeah, or something to protect, or something to earn, or to win, or there's got to be an incentive, hasn't there? Or a kind of target at the end to achieve. And I think it's being more strategic and creative, perhaps, in the way that we create these spaces to enable men to talk, rather than just being so dismissive and saying, well, men just don't talk.
Yeah, but we just don't go home and say, you know what, something's up, I feel down, I can't cope with things, No.
And that's the environment that Steve spent most of his time in, because we had two young children, and he was either at work or he was helping me with the children, and neither of those environments were conducive to him stopping and being open about how he was feeling. And it's why I do the work I do now. If people aren't able to speak openly at home for whatever reason, let's find spaces in the second place we spend most of our time, and that's in the workplace. How can we create spaces there for people to speak openly, or to have a line manager that they trust with private information, or to have mental health first aiders who know what they're doing and are supported enough to help others? There are ways and means that we can do this. I mean, I'm not one of those people that believes we can achieve zero suicide however much we'd like to, but I know that there are ways we can reduce it and minimize it.
So maybe that's a good segue to tell us a little bit more what you do now and how you, say, overcame the whole situation. Or if I say you're probably never going to overcome the situation, right? But how are you coping with it? And how are the kids coping with it as well? I mean...
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And like I say, they were so young at the time, 9 and 2. And we had the year from hell, basically, where we had all of the firsts and the initial anniversaries and milestones to get through. And then the second year wasn't much better. And then we had COVID, and that was shit, obviously, for everybody. And I remember a very distinctive moment during COVID when You could go out on the doorstep and bang your pots and pans for the NHS. And it's probably the only moment during the week in lockdown when you saw other people's faces. And I would look at the people that lived on our street, and there was always 2 adults and 2 kids standing on every doorstep. And I felt so alien. And I always pictured us as a square with 4 straight corners and straight sides. And there was me and Steve and the 2 kids. And suddenly there was just the 3 of us standing on our doorstep. And it felt wrong to me. I knew it felt wrong to society. We'd become this wonky little triangle overnight, and I couldn't cope with that at all. It just felt wrong. I felt completely alone and unable to be a parent on my own. And I hit rock bottom then. I was drinking, I was smoking, I was self-harming, I was not coping at all. And that's when I started to see a therapist. And she identified very quickly that I had zero kind of hope for the future. And she said a phrase to me that I have never forgotten. She said, "I will carry hope for you until you're ready to carry it for yourself." And she did. And we had some amazing sessions where I learned a lot from her, a lot of different CBT techniques, coping mechanisms, different books to read. As lockdown eased, I was able to go out, joined a gym, did a lot for my physical health as well as my mental and emotional health as well. I focused on my career and did some qualifications in internal communication, which is the line of work that I do. And I realised I was actually coping better with that triangle once I'd started to focus on me. And I saw a different kind of triangle, and it became my triangle of recovery. And there were 3 points to that. And the first one I realised was me, and dragging myself out of this rock bottom space that I'd ended up in, and making myself stronger, more resilient, and in a better place to raise my children, who were the second part of that triangle of recovery. And I could see these green shoots of resilience in them as they were growing and getting stronger and tougher and learning how to have the right conversations with the right people. And the third part of my triangle was my community. And that was knowing who to get rid of because they weren't serving me well anymore, or they weren't the right people to support me in this new life as a widow, not a wife anymore. And which new communities to become part of. And I joined, as I say, organisations like SOBS, which I now volunteer for. I became an ambassador for an amazing charity called Doctors in Distress. I'm speaking openly all the time on LinkedIn and joining communities there about these topics, and it's become my day job. And during all that time, I started to write as a part of my therapy, and that wasn't ever supposed to be a book. But I realised one day that I'd written about 20,000 words, and they seemed to be in chapters one after another. And people were saying, "Oh, you should write a book." So I did. And at the time, I'm not religious, and I don't believe in reincarnation, but I would see this little blackbird hopping around in the back garden, and he would come up to the back door and wasn't afraid like the other birds. They would all just fly off if I opened the door, but he was quite determined. And I would say to the girls, "Look, Daddy Blackbird's come to visit," just for something to say and to create some sort of connection. And they seemed to like that. I hated this bird because in the beginning, it kind of felt like he symbolised this sense of freedom that Steve now had, which was the opposite to what I had. So I was kind of chucking stones at him and trying to get rid of him when the children weren't looking. But in the end, because he was so persistent and he came every day, I kind of made friends with him. And he features quite heavily in my life now. We've got a China blackbird in the garden for the days that he doesn't come to visit. I called my book Daddy Blackbird. I called my business Daddy Blackbird Communications. And everything I do now is kind of symbolised by that triangle of recovery and our little blackbird.
Wow. That's, yeah, no, that's very moving. It's something you mentioned there about, obviously COVID amplified things. I mean, I was listening to a podcast. I think it was called Griefcast, but as it says, it's about dealing with grief. And there was a conversation on there that sort of said, when someone dies, everything continues as normal, and it's almost that drags you out of it doesn't help your grief, but it's almost like you've got no choice but to be moved along by the momentum of life, essentially.
Yeah.
But when COVID happened, it was like you look out the window and life wasn't going on as normal. So, it's, and I think, COVID just had, or lockdown, even though, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I feel like it was, physically it was necessary, mentally, we're still dealing with the fallout, as, we're pretty much discussing here.
Yeah.
I mean, sort of, how was that time with the girls?
Well, there was a kind of another element of my story that was a regrettable one. I just before lockdown, I got into a relationship which I shouldn't have done. I was so terrified of being on my own. I didn't feel like I could cope at all. I wasn't used to being on my own. I'd been with Steve for 18 years, and a guy I knew from school came to Steve's funeral and then would check in from time to time, and he would often say, I can help with this, I can sort that out for you, I can come and fix stuff if it's broken in the house or whatever. And eventually he spent a lot of time with us, and he moved in, and it turned out to be a very toxic and controlling relationship. And he was with us during COVID, and it was hell on earth. And for not just for me, but for the children and Evie in particular. And he controlled everything we did and said. So my grief was put on pause. I didn't have time or space to deal with my loss or my grief. I just had to work out how the hell I was going to get rid of this guy. And I did eventually. And that's kind of allowed my grief to then carry on. So COVID's got a lot to answer for in that regard. But also I hold a lot of regret and blame that I allowed this person into our lives. And that's had a huge impact on my children, like I say, Evie in particular, and kind of shaped how we feel about some certain types of men.
I mean, obviously there is nothing anyone can say, but I think, having guilt is part and parcel of being a parent. And, it is always like, oh, have I done that right? Have I done that right? Should I have made that decision? As they say, hindsight's 20/20. And, again, it's like an emotional situation, then throw in, society being turned upside down. I guess, I don't, you can't beat yourself up for that.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
I mean, have you had relationships since, if you don't mind me asking?
Absolutely not. And there's no intention to. My focus is now entirely on my children. And when they go off and leave home and go to university and do the things they're going to do, I intend to get a goat and spend a lot of time with my goat. Right. That's my plan. So when trust is shattered in the way that we've had it shattered, and the way that this kind of secondary challenge came along and just destroyed me, that's hard to go back into anything like that again. So I think I could rely on a goat rather than another relationship.
And keep the grass short as well.
Exactly. It's a win-win, isn't it?
So I mean, like I saw. I mean, you know, sort of mentioned that your girls are obviously older now. I mean, I think I saw on BBC that your daughter's sort of now started talking about her experience. I
Yeah,
mean, how
it
was?
was BBC, it was Sky News.
Oh, well, sorry. At least it wasn't GB News. But yeah. So I mean, how has that come about? And you know, has that sort of helped her? You know, and I guess you know, teenagers. It's a really difficult time for them, regardless. You know, at that age, and yeah, I mean, how you know has that helped her sort of channel her energies?
Oh, completely. From the person that she was at 9 and 10 years old, to who she is now, is she's unrecognizable. She's a force to be reckoned with in all the best possible ways. She's incredible. When she was about 11, she started senior school, and she realized that people are very flippant when it comes to the language around suicide, and they would say things like, I'd rather kill myself than go through another maths lesson like that, or they'll say KYS to each other. So if somebody's been a bit of a knob, they'll say, oh, KYS, and which means go and kill yourself. And they'll put it in text messages or in WhatsApp groups, and it's written on toilet walls, and everywhere there seems to be some reference to suicide in one way or another. And it got on top of her, and she couldn't cope with it. And she did what I do and wrote about it, and wrote a story about how she was feeling, which got turned into an animation about how we need to be more considerate about the language we use. And it was called Words Matter. And she showed it in that school at an assembly, and the kids laughed at it. And there were a few other things that weren't great about that school, and I moved her to the one she ended up thriving in for the last 3 years. And that conversation was picked up again around the language. She spoke to the head. He arranged for Sky News to come and film her doing an assembly. And she just smashed it. And I went along and watched it. And she was just incredible. And there was no laughing this time. Everyone took it very seriously. And I believe she's making a massive difference already with that. Through that, she won a National Mental Health Award last year. And so many good things have come off the back of that. And she's involved in lots of conversations where she's going to be helping to shape the support that kids get in schools around bereavement, all these sorts of things. So she's just doing amazingly. She's just slayed all of her GCSEs, as she says, and now has a summer to just put her feet up after having had prom last night, where she went along in a vintage fire engine and had the time of her life, and was the teenager she needs to be, and just let her hair down and had a party. But she takes life seriously too, and she's off to do a scholarship in music at college in September, and criminology as well. And her sister is 9 and is following in her footsteps too. She's a bit wild and needs a bit of shaping, but she'll get there too.
Which one reminds you most of Steve?
Oh, Evie, completely. She has the same eye colour, the same skin tone. She looks like him. She's got the same temperament. He was calm. He was measured. If there was a challenge or a problem, he would fix it. I am hot-headed, angry, and a bit wild at times. And Ada's the same as me, the younger one. And she has the same skin tone, the same eye colour, everything. It's just crazy how similar Evie is to Steve and how similar Ada is to me, and how they spend time together, and they're a blend of the two of us, and I can see that in them together. That's quite magical, really. That's a good question. Thank you for asking.
Oh, that's all right. I'm just going to ask one more, and I'll let Volker get back in there. I mean, you sort of mentioned about, and I've just had that moment that I said would happen where I've completely blanked on what I was going to say. Oh,
Maybe it's Volker's turn to ask a question.
Yeah, go on,
Well,
Volker.
what you just said with your younger daughter, I mean, she was 2 at the time, right? So she does she even remember your husband? No. So how does that evolve in her life? I mean, there's obviously a void, right?
Yeah, completely. And I often was concerned that there would be some fallout there, that Evie had memories of Steve and that Ada didn't. They do tend to fill in the gaps sometimes and make stuff up. They see photos of them in certain scenarios and they'll fill in those gaps and tell their own stories. And I will help with that sometimes. But there's no getting around the fact that there is a massive void, that Ada never knew her dad and never had the chance to even start that. And that's one of the saddest things about that. And both his parents have died. There's no family. There's no way other than my own memories to fill that in for her. So that's a really sad thing that I can't change. And I have to just be two parents as much as I possibly can to her.
Is your father still alive?
No, he died when I was in my mid-20s.
Oh, sorry.
So Father's Day is shit in our house.
Yeah.
Mother's Day is a big one then.
It is. It's probably big. Yes, absolutely. Yes, there's a lot of pressure on them. And luckily, my friend Emma, who's their godmother, who is just an incredible person, deals with all of that sort of stuff. So she will help them buy presents. You know, as if you're a dad, you would go out and take your kids out to buy a Mother's Day card and to pick a present for them or to get some flowers and make a card or whatever. Emma steps into those shoes and does all of that stuff and gazillions of things on top of that. So I'm very lucky that I've got people like her to support me and to support my children. I read somewhere, it was an article by the charity Young Minds, that children need a trusted adult in their lives other than a parent that they can go to for help and support. And I remember when Steve died thinking, what happens if I die? Who have they got? And we were sat in the bank a couple of days after Steve died, and I turned to Emma and said, what happens if I die? And she said, I'll look after them, darling. And I said, okay. And that was that.
She sounds like a good friend.
Yeah, she really is.
I had a bit of a mental blank a moment ago, and I've now remembered my question. I mean, you sort of talked about, well, that, you know, anger was such a big feature, like in the early days. And then you sort of talked about, you know, the pride that you've got from what Evie's doing and going to the prom. I mean, in those moments, how do you talk with Steve? Do you know, like, as in, oh, look what our daughter's doing? And is that with affection, or is it, look what she's doing despite, you know, the circumstances?
Another good question. Probably a little bit of both. There are some elements of me that would think he doesn't deserve to see her doing these things because he chose to go. And that's a hard one to accept. Then there are some elements of me that would just want to sit and chat to him and tell him about all these amazing things that she's achieving. It's one of the reasons why I talk so openly, and I do this kind of grieving out loud thing where I will post about this often, and I talk to my world and they talk back to me, and they will say that they're proud to see all of this amazing stuff going on, whether that's LinkedIn followers or other people that I know in different groups. And sometimes that helps a little bit to ease that kind of missing piece that Steve isn't here to provide. So yeah, there's not one clear answer to that question. It's a bit of everything. And grief has a funny way of taking you by surprise, doesn't it? It can take you on a whole journey in one day where you can wake up feeling fine, and then something will happen with the girls. Like Ada in the younger years would have said things like, I know what I want for my birthday. And I'll say, brilliant, I don't have to worry about what to get you now. What is it? And she'll say, I want my dad back. and I'll think, fuck, I can't do that. And then I'm sobbing, and then she'll run off, come back and say, actually, no, I changed my mind. I want a unicorn. And wow. Okay, that's good, because I can't do the other thing. Well, actually, I can't give you a unicorn either, but either way, it's best that you don't want your dad back anymore. So then I'm angry at him for making that question come about. And then I'm back to being maybe calmer later that day because something else has happened and somebody has done something nice, or, circumstances have changed in the day. So it's a wild ride every day, isn't it? And you experience all of that and more in one day.
You ever thought of giving up?
Yes. Particularly in that first year when I was at rock bottom and I was drinking and I was self-harming, and I didn't want to be here anymore either. I didn't think I was giving the girls what they needed. I brought this man into our lives who was a complete arsehole and was treating us in the worst possible way. And I felt worthless. I felt like I was just doing them more harm than good. I didn't stay like that for long. I found my big girl pants and I put them back on again, and I kicked the arsehole out, and I got on with our lives, and I did everything I possibly could to move away from that place, and I remained determined to never ever go back there again. But yeah, I did feel like that at one point.
Maybe so we slowly need to come to an end, or coming to an end. It would be great to touch a little bit more on what you're doing now, right? Because you're speaking in organizations as well. What you're hoping to change in the workplace? What is your objective at the moment, to go out and talk in workplaces in particular, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my skill set is in internal communication. I did that for 10 years, and I've loved it. Being able to go into an organization and shape the way that they communicate about any topic, and the way that they listen to employees, and shape the way they do things, shape the resources that are provided to key people like line managers, for example, is just a real privilege. And knowing that I can make a difference by sharing my lived experience and my own story now, to make that emotional connection as well, and specify the work that I do around well-being and mental health, and this huge suicide issue that we have, particularly in the workplace, it feels like a gift I can't turn away. So that has become everything I do now. And I'll go into organizations, I will talk about my experience very openly, like I've done today. I'll recommend ways that we can communicate, every one of us, in more compassionate ways, and be more open about this topic. Like we spoke about earlier, create these spaces where suicide isn't a word that we have to whisper. Yeah. It's a word that we can talk about openly, like any other word. But also be more strategic in the way that organizations are looking at this from a proactive perspective, and making sure that line managers have the tools that they need, and senior leaders are open to having these conversations and to bringing the right people and the right resources in. So there's a huge amount that I do, and that I love, and that has become everything to me, all around this topic. The British Standard is now added to that. There's a new British Standard, which is out for draft at the moment till the middle of July. Don't know when this is going to go out. But after that, it will be a standard that gets published in October, which will be the kind of standard of excellence around how we communicate in organisations in terms of suicide prevention, intervention and postvention, critically, which is just so important that we have a standard out there to follow. So there's another triangle for me. It's my internal comms knowledge, my lived experience, and this standard that I'm already talking about, and getting involved with different committees regarding, and encouraging organisations to pick it up and run with it before it's even out there officially. Talking about my book is something I do all the time, so people understand my story. There's a scene in Afterlife with Ricky Gervais where he's walking out into the sea, and he's intending to take his own life, and he's getting further and further out to sea, and his dog is on the beach, and she barks at him, and it kind of shakes him out of this moment where he's just hell-bent on walking into the ocean, and he stops and turns around and walks back. And I often think of myself as Brandy, the dog, barking at people with my story. And if I can stop people walking into their sea or traveling down their dark tunnel and not turning back, then that's what I will do, because I believe that there was somebody out there that could have done that for my husband. It just didn't happen at the right time. And if I can do that for somebody else, and I can be the dog that barks and encourages somebody to maybe get the help that they need, or to have the conversation that's going to make a difference, whether that's in a workplace or in a broader community, then that's what I will do.
Great analogy. Thank you.
I mean, unfortunately, we are at time now. I mean, thank you so much, Caroline. I mean, you're doing amazing work. I'm sure you will have inspired listeners that perhaps are going through dark times themselves, that, there is always light on the other side, life is always on the other side. It's going to be very different, but, so, I mean, if people, well, I'm sure people will want to find out a bit more about you and find out about the book. So, how can they find out about your different offerings?
Yeah, so the book is on Amazon, and you can find it's called Daddy Blackbird, obviously. I'm on LinkedIn quite a lot, so you can find me at Caroline Roodhouse. I do a Substack as well, so I decided to break the book down into chapters that I publish once a week, for people that want that in kind of bite-sized articles. So yeah, lots of different ways.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks very much, and send our best to the children, and yeah, keep up the great work.
I will.
Yeah,
thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Feel free to reach out to Volker or David via our website, www.manupdown.com, or podcast@manupdown.com, with any feedback or to let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. Hear you again soon.